There was always a minority afraid of something, and a great majority afraid of the dark, afraid of the future, afraid of the past, afraid of the present, afraid of themselves, shadows of themselves. Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451. The skies have secrets, and sometimes those secrets burst out. It's a vestige from our early past, as illustrated by the fossil of the Tong child, which had been the victim of an oversized eagle. Death and terror could dive at us from the skies and kill us before we even knew it. Or even worse, explode upon us so that we knew our terrible fate as it happened. The skies can still inspire terror. Death can still come from above, although it's far more likely to be launched by another human now than hunting birds. Because we have seen this play out in other places, it's all the more terrifying when it comes home. The recent spate of drones illegally swarming over airports and other sensitive areas brings that fact home, that even though wars may exist in other places, they can also come to us. With these incursions, the question comes over and over, what do we do? So far, the answer has been not much. The problem is that in deciding to do something, we have to admit that there's a problem we need to do something about. And it's a problem most people would just really prefer not to confront at this moment. Of course, as we continually say, everything old is new again. Things in the sky that might not be allowed to be in that particular bit of sky have happened many times since man launched himself into the air. Even if the ability to send swarms of flying things without men actually inside is a rather new one. There's a reason we end up fighting in and over the skies, and that reason is rarely simple. In August of 1946, World War II had been over for nearly a year. And to be fully clear, the conflict was definitively called World War II by that point. From our Western perch 80 plus years in the future, it looks as though the war ended and things became rosy in many places. We won, after all. Then we rebuilt. Yes, the Cold War came and it was scary, but it wasn't as destructive as the total war that had been waged until 1945 had been. That really underplays the end of the war, though. The fighting did not end when World War II did. Aside from several battles being waged after victory was declared in Europe, mainly in the Balkans, the Allies were already fragmenting before the war even officially ended. Stalin and Churchill had agreed on spheres of influence, and neither of them bothered to consult those actually living within the spheres they allocated amongst themselves. In some cases, there was vehement disagreement with the sphere allocation, and this very nearly created a new war before World War II itself ended over the city of Trieste. May of 1945 was the end of the war in Europe, but it was also the possible trigger date for a new conflict, as both the Yugoslav partisan troops and Western Allied troops raced to Trieste. Yugoslavia had a long history of argument for the area and several points in their favor. Italy had points of order in their favor as well. It all came to a head as the partisan troops and New Zealand troops reached Trieste at the same time. The Yugoslavs rapidly cabled the New Zealand troops as they approached. We request Allied troops immediately withdraw to west of the river Isonzo, and that military authorities do not mix in our internal affairs. After this warning, 4th Army will not be responsible for anything that might happen if our request is not met. This is categorical. The Yugoslav request was not met. The New Zealanders also occupied the city, and things got very, very tense And then suddenly, on May 21st, Tito agreed to withdraw to the occupation lines suggested by France. It seemed that the crisis was over. But it wasn't. Just over 1 year later, on August 9th, 1946, an American transport plane on its way to Trieste from Vienna was shot down. Although one crew member, who was Turkish, was severely wounded, the other 9 were not and were taken to officers' barracks in Ljubljana and held as prisoners. The uproar amongst American decision makers was immediate and intense. Acting Secretary of State Dean Acheson fired off increasingly angry memos. This is not the kind of matter which in normal circumstances and in other parts of the world leads to friction between governments. The only flights which have taken place over Yugoslavia are those of planes which are lost and through inadequate radio beaming cannot find out where they are. And when they come out of the overcast, they are several miles into Yugoslav territory. It's the kind of thing which would happen on the Mexican border or the Canadian border between many countries. Nobody shoots down planes that are lost between clouds trying to get home. His description of the events is precisely what the argument was over. According to the Yugoslavs, the skies had been clear when Yugoslav planes scrambled and shot down the transport flight. They claimed it had been unresponsive to hailing attempts. Furthermore, the Yugoslavs had previously lodged complaints about Allied flights using Yugoslav airspace without permission. More than 170 flights from mid-July to August 8th, the Yugoslav Foreign Ministry reminded everyone. The incident continued to escalate. On August 19th, another plane was shot down. At first, it was simply classified as missing, and no one seemed to have any idea what might have happened. The truth soon came out, though. Yugoslav planes had again scrambled to intercept a transport flight in their airspace, and again had shot it down. This time there were no survivors, however. Witnesses on the ground there were. 2 United Nations relief aid workers on holiday at Lake Bled actually witnessed the explosion. According to their direct quote, "It was completely overcast. There wasn't a break in the clouds." Tito personally responded by saying, "It was notorious that the day was absolutely clear and had perfect visibility." Weather reports backed up the relief workers. But the weather wasn't the actual reason for the incident, and it never was. Allied pilots were instructed to avoid Yugoslav airspace on their way to Trieste, which was fairly difficult in bad weather conditions. But the Yugoslavs weren't reacting just to constant bad weather flight encroachments. They were reacting to history. And the West wasn't interpreting the flight shootdowns through the Yugoslavs. They were doing so in the context of the emerging Cold War. As it turns out, there was a lot of misinterpretation on both sides. First off, the whole Trieste and Istrian area was a cauldron of seething resentments on the Yugoslav and Italian sides. The international city, as outlined by World War II agreements in Trieste, was a story that Yugoslavs had seen play out before in what is now called Rijeka after World War I, when, despite the fighting efforts of Woodrow Wilson, the city was proclaimed a free city with the Italian name of Fiume, and in short order occupied by Italian nationalists and then just absorbed by Mussolini. The treatment of minorities in Fiume was horrible, with forced assimilation and Italian language, the forced disbanding of Slavic cultural institution, and then eventually racial laws against the Jewish minority, as ordered by the Italian government in 1938. Aside from issues of land rights, the Yugoslav view of protecting Slavic people was based on real events of the immediate past. However, the Yugoslav brand of justice was much more stark than most of the Allies had the stomach for. As the partisans rolled through liberating areas, there was no time spent gathering enemies and assumed enemies up for a lengthy international trial. It was all handled by the Yugoslavs themselves in double quick time. And not everyone caught up in the moment was guilty. The Allies were trying to prevent Italy from falling over into the edge, into communism. And Italy had a robust communist movement emerging after the war. Western nations feared, one, the Yugoslav vengeance against Italian fascists would push a vulnerable country over the edge into communism, rather than saving it as a Western ally. And two, they were worried about the spread of communism itself. Tito had spent most of his life engaged in communist agitating. He even participated in the Russian Revolution in 1917. As Winston Churchill's famous speech in Fulton, Missouri spelled out, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. And this is where the biggest misconception took place, which was outright stated by the September 2nd, 1946 issue of Time magazine. Behind Tito's demand for the city stood Russia, eager to see how far the U.S. would go to stop communist expansion. Washington's violent reaction to Yugoslav attacks had cleared the air. Moscow now knew that a coup to seize Trieste could well mean war with the U.S. What we now know is that such was not the case. In fact, although the Soviets were willing to verbally support Tito in his efforts at Trieste and in keeping Yugoslav skies clear of possible Western spy flights, Stalin had no interest in supporting a claim to Trieste. He was comfortable with his spheres of influence as decided with Churchill, even if Churchill himself had second thoughts on the whole matter. And even more, Stalin was urging Tito behind the scenes to just stop being so difficult. Although no one knew it at the time, a communist showdown was in the making between Tito and Stalin that would have massive ramifications for the entire Cold War world. The Yugoslav flight shootdowns are not much discussed now because they were settled with diplomacy and, in the end, did not demonstrably lead to immediate consequences. There were far bigger things going on. The crisis over the Dardanelles in Turkey, for instance, and the Greek Civil War, with Tito having a strong hand in at least one of these issues as well. But it's easy to forget, with our hindsight of things managing to turn out okay, how fraught the situation actually was. At the same time that planes were shot down heading to Trieste, reports were coming in that the Sovs were sending explosives over and into Finland and Sweden. It turns out that those were meteors. But in an alternate timeline where diplomacy did not take precedence in an immediately post-war Europe, it very well could have set off a hot war instead of the Cold War that developed. There's much difference between today's drone swarms into Western Europe and the shootdowns in 1946, at the top of which is the frequency of the whole thing. Drone incursions in sensitive places have been an issue for 3 years at this point. And the Trieste crisis in 1946 took place over a period of about 20 days in total. Diplomacy worked in 1946, but perhaps it worked because it was backed up without question by the promise of a military reaction in the immediate short term. There was a time limit on the availability of diplomatic ending. Actions would, without question, have consequences. Without consequences, why bother negotiating? In the words of Dwight D. Eisenhower, anyone who becomes immersed in international affairs soon realizes that no important issue exists in isolation. Rarely is it only bilateral. A problem which may seem of interest to only 2 countries almost invariably affects a third and often is not a fourth or more. This was as true for a small free city in 1946 as it is in today's interconnected world.
What to do